Hi, my name is Arissa. I also go by the online name Corgi Dev. I do just want to apologize ahead of time if you hear barking in the background. My dog has decided that she is going to be heard no matter what I wish. Uh, just how they are sometimes. Um, doesn't help that there's a lot of wind outside right now. And I think that's kind of upsetting her. But anyhow, I work in accessibility. I I do talks every now and then, just as a CYA. Anything I say is uh, not necessarily the opinion of my or the views of my employers, current or former. They are just anything I say is just kind of like my own opinions and thoughts that I have or conclusions I've come to over the years based on my own personal experiences. And with accessibility, I think it's very important to also remember that we are constantly changing how we think is like the best way to fix something in accessibility or to make something accessible. You can have 10 accessibility professionals in the room and all of them have a different viewpoint on how they think anything in accessibility should be handled. It's just kind of the nature. There can be multiple ways of doing the same thing. Um, with that being said, I guess first thing is, when I usually I like to do talks. I'm actually working on one right now for accessibility testing, which is why I chose to make this video. This is kind of me kind of going through like some of my thoughts and stuff on how I want to do that. Usually when I do a talk, I use a PowerPoint, uh, but in this particular case, I'm actually leaning towards having something kind of just a little bit more informal, where I just kind of have like an outline of points I want to hit and go from there. Um, so when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about how well people of different abilities are able to access your content, understand it, uh, that kind of thing. Sorry, had to get a drink. um, and when it comes to like accessibility, it's important to remember that there can be a lot of things that count as a disability, essentially. Obviously, we typically have like our legal definitions for what we think of as disability or medical definitions and whatnot. But just overall, you can have a lot of different things that require accessibility to come into play. You can have someone who has limited mobility. You can have someone who has low vision or is blind. You can have someone with a cognitive condition that causes them to have trouble focusing. Um, Someone with dyslexia, someone who is colorblind. You can have someone with a auditory processing disorder like myself, um, who needs captioning of it to be available if need be. All of these things technically count as instances where accessibility would greatly benefit people. Um, you can also have instances where someone is going to be looking for a particular bit of information on a website while they're in a stressed state, and how you have that information available for them to find can technically be a form of accessibility. Is it are they able to understand where they need to go to find that information? You can have people who have different levels of technology or technology expertise. Not everybody has as much experience with technology as everyone else. Uh, Not everybody's got the newest and best computer. Not everybody's using the same browser. And so how you build your content can impact how those people can access it, or whether they can at all. Um, and so with that, I've just got a couple of windows here to pull up. Now, a lot of your accessibility, like when it comes to legal regulations, regardless of where you are in the world, typically they are based, at least in part, on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These were created by the W3C, their Web Accessibility Initiative, which W3C stands for World Wide Web Consortium, just in case you didn't know. Currently, they are at 2.1 with 2.2 slated to come out later this year, and hopefully 3.0 will come out eventually after that. But this is typically like what you'll see a lot of your regulations based around is the W3C's WCAG guidelines. And the guidelines are divided up into 4 principles, which are also known as the POUR principles. These are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And those guidelines, those principles basically give you an idea of like what each section of the guidelines is trying to accomplish. Which the main thing is that you're wanting to make sure that as many people as possible can access your content and that you're not unfairly blocking someone from information or from services through no fault of their own. And when there was a reasonable way that you could have made it available. This is especially important. I mean, COVID was a prime example of how important it was to have information be available. There have been, unfortunately, a lot of instances during COVID where people who had various disabilities weren't able to get the care that they should have been able to because information just wasn't available to them. One instance of like a good example of people making things accessible during COVID was I live in Kentucky, and here when the governor would do his reports about COVID, they actually had a sign language interpreter available. They had captioning available to make sure that hopefully as many people as possible would be able to get that information. There was web pages for it. There was pamphlets available. You know, they tried to make all that information available as possible, as much as possible. Was it perfect? No, but there was an effort made, and there should be an effort made in everything to make it accessible. Now, with the POUR principles, again, we had perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable, we're basically trying to make sure that people can actually perceive the fact that the content is there. They can identify, like, that there's interactive elements on the page or there's not. They can identify that there's video content on the page or there's not. Then we get into operable, which is making sure that they can actually interact with that content, regardless of whether they're using a mouse and keyboard, just a keyboard, or like voice commands, things of that nature. Then you're making sure that it's understandable. Okay, they can perceive that the content is there, they can interact with it, can they understand why they're interacting with it and how they're supposed to interact with it. So like for instance, this would be like if you have a form on a page, making sure that people understand what fields are required. Is there a specific format they need to fill out the fields in? You may not necessarily have a specific format. I have seen forms where, like a phone number, for instance, they had it where the person could just type in the numbers, they could format it different ways, and the system would still get it as long as the right number of numbers were present. In other cases, you may have like a required format that they have to fill it out in, and you want to make sure that they can understand what that format is and identify errors if any have happened so that they can correct them. And then you have robust. Robust gets back to that whole idea of like people using different methods of interacting with their computer, people using screen readers or other assistive technologies, making sure that those people can actually access it. You know, if someone is unable to use a mouse, they're just using a keyboard, can they actually access everything on your page and get to it? And some of this is also in some of the other areas. It's not. Um, there is a little bit of overlap between the principles. Um, Another thing that Robust deals with is um, like with the different browsers. If someone's using different browsers, they're not locked into one specific one. Uh, are you making sure that there's a fairly reliable chance that, regardless of whether they're using Firefox, Brave, Chrome, Edge, whatnot, they'll be able to actually load the content? And so, I mean, that's kind of like an important thing that you want to make sure to watch out for. Now, with these guidelines, a lot of times, you see how many there are, and it's like, okay, well, how do we figure out how to apply these? How do we figure out if these apply? Well, first we're going to start with conformance level. In WCAG, at least up till 2.1, there is talk of changing this in, I think, 3. But at least for right now in 2.1, you have 3 conformance levels. These are A, AA, and AAA. Now, coming from being a video game player, kind of don't like having them say AAA, because AAA to me kind of like implies that, oh, that's like the gold standard, that's what we need to be shooting for, when in reality, that's not the case here. Even in the WCAG guidelines, when you look under like the conformance descriptions, it's not actually in, or actually I think it is in this page. Yeah, here we go, conformance level. So here notice it says, it is not recommended that level AAA conformance be required as a general policy for entire sites, because it is not possible to satisfy all level AAA content, or AAA success criteria for some content. So the way I have found that's like the best way to kind of explain this to people, okay, AA, which also includes the regular A level ones. To be truly AA conformant, you have to first be A. Because A is basically like, this is the bare minimum that you should be doing. This is the stuff that, like, if you're using best practices and whatnot, you should be meeting it. AA is the that extra level of certainty that you're hopefully being accessible. And it's typically what a lot of government regulations are geared around. They're typically written with AA conformance in mind. Now, whether or not they are going by 2.1 or 2.0 or 2.0 or 2.1, that can be a little up in the air. Most people should be aiming for 2.1. But again, like with that being said, AA is generally, that's your go-to. That's where you need to be trying to aim for. And then AAA is basically like the special cases. So a good example here, I'm just gonna scroll back up here. We're gonna go to the time-based media stuff under 1.2 in WCAG. Now, 1.2, you're dealing with, again, it's titled time-based media. These are like videos and audio that you have playing, live recordings, pre-recorded content, things like that. Like, this would actually be pre-recorded content because I am recording it and then I am going to be putting it up on YouTube after I finish. You might not have any time-based content, and so that immediately is just going to say, okay, well, none of this applies to me because I don't have audio or video or live or pre-recorded content of any sort. But if it did, you'll notice here we've got under the A and AA, we have that, like, if it's audio only, do we have something else, like an alternative? So if there's audio, do you have like a transcript available or something? Some way that someone else can like get that content if they can't hear it. Um, Down here we have captions. Okay, so do you have captions on your pre-recorded content? That should be just like something that you have all the time. For instance, when I upload a video to YouTube, I always make sure to have the automated captions turned on first so that there can at least be a starting point for the captions. And then I'll go back and I typically try to edit them to actually make them more accurate. Now when we get into like AA, we've also got captions for live content. So do we have captions provided for live content? This is like where you get the captions on TV. Because if there wasn't captions on TV, there'd be a whole subset of people that would just be kind of left out with no idea of what's being said, what's happening. And then you've got these audio descriptions. And this is also like, when you're describing certain things that are happening on the stage, so like, or on like in a recording, you might like describe other like there's wind rustling, you're not just showing the words that are being said, you're also kind of describing some of the other stuff that's relevant and going on. Now, AAA, we get into having sign language for pre-recorded. Unfortunately, I'm not gonna have sign language for this. I don't know enough sign language, and I don't have someone else here with me that can do it. But it would be nice. Like, I mean, if I have been trying to learn sign language, so if I get to a point where I know enough that I could sign out my videos, I totally would. But it's one of those things. It's something that's good to have if you can do it, and it's also good to do if like you're going to have a primarily like sign language using audience. That can be a particularly valuable thing. Now, don't assume, because this is something I commonly see in accessibility. Oh, well, you'll hear people say, oh, every blind person obviously knows Braille, so why don't we just offer Braille of everything? Or every deaf person obviously knows sign language, so why don't we just have sign language all the time? And it's like, that's not always the case. Not all deaf people use sign language. Not all people who have sight loss have learned Braille, especially if they went blind or lost their sight to some degree later in life. It's just like with anything, it gets a little harder sometimes to learn that kind of thing. And there just might be some people that they don't. Then we have the extended audio descriptions. So you notice here, like, when pauses in the foreground audio are insufficient to allow audio descriptions to convey the sense of the video. And it's talking about, like, do you have, like, those extra, like, audio descriptions to, like, say that there's a silence, there's a pause, extended pause, little extra details into that description. And again, these are things that it's good to include, but you're not going to necessarily be considered just like non-conformant just because you didn't. So that's something that's always good, because I mean, especially when you talk about compliance with anything, you can often hear people like wanting to shoot for the highest level when that's not necessarily what's required. And in some cases, the other problem that you can run into with some of these is that they may kind of conflict a little bit, and so that can be a problem. Okay, so now we've kind of like gone over that, like conformance levels. You also have to consider what platform you're on, if it's desktop or mobile, because what you're going to test for, what's going to apply, is going to differ between the two. You're not going to necessarily test things the same way. We're not going to test with a keyboard on a mobile phone. If you're testing a mobile app, you're going to be testing with like hand gestures, like swiping, and so there's just going to be differences in like what guidelines apply and how you're going to test the ones that do apply. That's why a lot of places that you'll see that come up with like their test plans, they'll typically have a different test plan for mobile than they will for desktop, They may have some guidelines where they just automatically say does not apply. We're not worrying about this. Okay, we know we're going for AA. Maybe these are the AAA items that we do want to include, especially if for our audience. And then you're going to have to try to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to test these? What can we test on mobile? What can we test on desktop? And then you're going to go through and you're going to say, okay, well, we know that these are the items that apply on mobile. But do they apply in this particular app instance? Because again, going back to like the pre-recorded video and audio, well, if you don't have any video or audio, you're obviously not going to, you're just going to mark all those as not apply. Similar like with if you don't have any images. Let's say your page is purely text. Okay, well then you're not going to worry about any of like the alt text ones for images, the color contrast that deals with user interface or images you're not necessarily going to have to worry about. Maybe you have no forms, because there are some of the guidelines that are particular to form elements. Okay, well, we're not worried about that. So that's kind of like the thing there. You're gonna have to go through and kind of figure out, okay, what level of conformance are we wanting to go for, and then for our individual platforms, how are we applying those, or which ones are we going to be able to like, and then per like individual test instance, okay, well, which ones of these are actually going to apply in this specific instance. Now next, you're going to want to look at like, what tools do you want to use? Now there is that draw to want to automate. You want to automate everything, but you can't automate accessibility, not 100%. And that's something important to remember. Automated tests can be great. They can help you to like pick out little things here or there, but they shouldn't be your like sole source of truth as to how conformant you are. Because some automated tests you may need to go back and verify, and then also there may be some where just really you need to manually check them. A great example is alt attributes on images. Okay. With an alt attribute on an image, you can have it null, which is when you just have alt and no value, or it's like alt equals empty string. When you do that for assistive technology, it basically treats it as a decorative image. It says, you can ignore this image, there's no information here that is necessary, it's just decoration. Now, a automated test is going to come along and it's going to say, oh, well, you've got alt attributes on all your images. But it's not going to be able to know if the ones that you left null, should they have been left null, or should they have not been left null. The ones that you put a value in there for, well, does the value actually portray the meaning and purpose, like the intent of that image? A good example, here just the other day, I was actually looking at a page and they had some artwork listed. And all the images had alt attributes with values, which good. All the alt attribute was it was the name of the painting, the artist's name, and then the URL for where you could go look at that image. Now there's a few things wrong there. I mean, one, you're not actually describing what's in the image. And that can be difficult. I mean, it can be difficult to figure out what you need to type sometimes. But you need to try to make an effort to like make sure that that alt attribute actually describes the image. And then they had that link in there. Well, you can't select the text that's in an alt attribute when you're the user unless you go into DevTools and actually look at the source for the page. You can't access that alt text. It's not like they can copy paste that URL into a browser. They can't interact with that. So what would have probably been the better option in that case? Well, honestly, after looking at the page, my impression of it was that they should have had like fig captions. So it's when you have like an image and you actually link it to a caption. Now in the caption, they could have had the name of the artwork, the artist name, and that URL. They could have even just like linked the URL around the image name if they'd wanted to. And then have an alt description, like an ARIA description or an alt text that actually like described the image itself. Like what was actually the content of that image. That would have been the better way to handle that, because then that way that alt value would actually accurately convey what that image was. That's kind of one of those like points where sometimes I'm sure there may be other people that don't completely agree with me on that, or that have a different viewpoint of how that would have been handled. But just for me, like having that URL in the alt attribute, if nothing else, that was kind of a no, don't do that. Don't put URLs in the alt attributes, because alt attributes should be human readable text. It shouldn't be like a URL or something. It should just be like regular text, typically. So I mean, that's the thing. Like an automated test would have looked at that and it would have just seen that there was an alt attribute and been like, oh, well, it's obviously fine. Similarly, like let's say, let's look at the WCAG page here, for instance. Okay. Hopefully I don't get proven wrong on this, because I actually have not inspected this before. But if I go and I inspect, yeah, okay. If I inspect this, you'll notice like the success criterion 1.2.6 sign language pre-recorded. It's visually it is formatted to look like a header. And it is in fact formatted as a header. Now, why do I point that out? If an automated test came through, it's going to pick up that, and that's good, because that's actually done correctly. But let's say every single bit of this text on this page was just paragraphs. There were no headers. And then someone went through with CSS and just bolded them, increased font size with just CSS to make them visually look like headers. An automated test is going to see that, and it's not going to point it out. It's just going to be like, okay, that's good. It's not going to say, hey, you have no headers, or there are some that can slightly like suggest that, hey, you don't have any headers. These things kind of look like they might be headers, but it's not going to necessarily be able to. And a lot of the tools just don't. They just look for are there headers, are there not headers? And if there are headers, okay, are they going in logical order? Do you have like a single H1 followed by a 2, 3, 4, whatever? Or are you skipping numbers? Did you start with an H2? Do you have multiple H1s? Which you can't. It's not a failure to have multiple H1s. It's just not considered best practice. Best practice is to have a single H1 and then everything else is below that, with the primary H1 basically being like the title or like the main header for the entire page. Now, a lot of really good automated tools, and I'm just going to pull up a couple of the ones I've got. I've got Arc Toolkit, Axe DevTools, and Accessibility Insights. Personally, Accessibility Insights is my favorite. I'm a little biased. I got to contribute to it, so, there's that. But here, since Axe DevTools is a common one, just gonna pull this up. Okay, so you'll notice here we have just these automated scans, and then down here it actually does have some guided manual tests, intelligent guided tests. So I can just go through and I can do a test, and there are some like customizations you can make, because you can say, okay, I want to also include the things that you view as true failures, and then I want the things that, well, these are just best practices. Okay, it's going to go through. Now, it gave me a few little things, and these aren't necessarily, you can have failures like this, and they can be things where it's like, okay, well, we have an alternative that's worked into here, and it's just not, it's only registering this part, it's not registering the other part that makes it work. I'm not sure on these because I actually have to like look into them more, but yeah, you can get these, and this can give you an idea. Now, I will say a lot of times it's good to still record these kinds of things, and then just mark, like, this is why we said that these don't apply in this case, because that can save you some time down the line when someone comes back and they're like, well, why didn't you fix this? You could say, well, because we technically already did, this just isn't picking it up. The other problem with a lot of these automated tools is that a lot of them, for instance, if I like change a page, I'm gonna run scan and see if it comes up with anything different. So just waiting for this to complete its analysis. Okay, so it's the same number of issues it comes up with. I have had a lot of cases where resizing the page would cause there to be more or fewer issues based on how the page reflowed. And that's the thing. A lot of these automated tests, they're not going through and they're not going to like test your page at different sizes. So they're not going to necessarily tell you, okay, well, you have this many issues when it's this wide. It's got this many issues when it's this wide. You're not going to pick up on all that. It's going to test it at like whatever you initially had it set to, and that's it. I had one page I checked once where when it was widescreen, it had something like 16 issues. And then when I narrowed it, because of the way things resized, it actually had like 36 issues. But if I hadn't resized it, if I had just run it initially, it wouldn't have told me that. And it's not gonna, tell you, even if it was to resize it. Okay, well then is it gonna tell me like at what sizes that appears? That's part of the problem. So you have that, like, some of the things that it's not going to be able to necessarily tell that, okay, it thinks it meets it but doesn't really. It's not going to necessarily check for like different sizing, and then you've also, you need to run it for like different platforms. But again, that's why, and I can't do it right now just because I don't have the paid version of this, but a lot of good tools will include manual checks as well. As well as, you can obviously have like your own manual test plans that you have written out. Just if you do that, of course, make sure to take into account whether or not you're testing on desktop, mobile, include screen reader testing so that you cover that. The other tool I really like to use is I do like Accessibility Insights by Microsoft. They do have a desktop app version of this, which here I'm just gonna pull that up here real quick. So like basically with this, I can actually test like applications on my computer, or specific windows and whatnot. They also I have this installed too, even though I don't actually use it, but well, not right now. If I decide to do some Android development, I might. But they also have a Android version that you can run on your desktop that is meant for if you're building applications. I can't, since I don't have the an actual app or whatever I'm developing, I can't pull it up right now. But it would be similar to that other desktop version, but it would be geared towards Android. They also have a CI/CD pipeline version, so one that you can actually like put in. If you want to see a good example of that one in action, check out the Accessibility Insights GitHub repo. Now you will see it is powered by Axe Core, so it is technically like Accessibility Insights is using Axe. But you do get some extra added benefits on this because again, we have the automated checks. So if I go here and I let it run its automated check, okay, and it's going to come up with a couple things. It actually came, if you notice, it came up with basically the same. In fact, I mean, it's 7 failed instances. It's the same number as Axe came up with because it's using Axe Core. But then additionally, we do have like we have a tab checker, so we can actually go through and we can see. And it gives us some things that we can check off as being pass-fail in terms of like when it comes to tabbing through the page, do these things happen the way that they should? And then it gives you like some of the needs review, which is kind of similar to Axe actually does the same thing with some of them. You get this nice little format. I do like this. I like the way that you can export the data a little bit better on this because I just think it's a lot nicer. I think if I remember right, like I can show it in a moment, but it basically exports it in sort of like a HTML format, which is kind of nice. In fact, here I'll just export. So you notice it just exports it as a nice little HTML file that I can then like look at and it shows me. And even if I go through the tab stops, it would actually like tell me which ones of those I failed and which ones I passed. And it tells me which all ones of the automated checks passed and failed as well. Now, the other thing I like about Accessibility Insights in particular is that I can go into this assessment option and it has some of the automated checks, but then it also has like these guided manual checks. Sorry, a little bit of a brain fart there. So it goes through and it's like having you check for keyboard traps and things of that nature. And these are basically like just going through in their manual checks for like checking the web content accessibility guidelines, essentially. Some of them might be essentially like a couple of guidelines combined and whatnot, but they're just like manual ways to check for certain common issues. So that's the thing. Like, and again, if I was to go through and do all of this, I can then export that. Now, if you've done like your checks, you've used your manual checks, maybe you have like your own, there are some that you can use. So again, like we have the Accessibility Insights. Visa actually has their global accessibility requirements, and you can technically use these. Like they actually give like different test procedures, requirements, some different tools that you can use for like checking them. And there are a ton of tools out there. I can show you a few tools here in just a little bit that I have. They're, there's actually here. Wait. You might have something like here once it opens up. Color contrast analyzer is a good example of like a tool that you might use. You can also, and this just lets me, let me minimize this window so you can see this a little bit better. This just lets me like go through and I can like take a couple of pictures and I can say, okay, if this is the foreground and this is the background, does it pass various levels of WCAG conformance? And even gives like nice little descriptions of like what each level actually means in terms of like contrast numbers. You can also find a lot of browser like extensions, bookmarklets. Bookmarklets are when you have like the little stuff that you pull up here to your like bookmark bar. So like for instance, you'll notice I've actually got a few of them up here. I've got Andy, which is the, hopefully I remember this correctly. Accessible. Never mind. I cannot remember it. It's made by the Social Security Administration. And I can actually just look it up. Oh, here, install. Yeah, accessible name and description inspector. And again, this is a nice like little free tool from the Social Security Administration. You can actually, they have an open source GitHub repo if you want to contribute to it, or pull it down and I guess customize it, maybe. And all you do is like you just grab this little button here and you just drag it up to your toolbar or your browser bar, and it would put it up here just like this. And you'll notice like if I hover over it, it just has like a little JavaScript little widget to it. And what that does is if I click that, it brings up this like little bar and it just gives me like different areas I can check. My favorite one with it is actually the table tool. And I've actually got my little certifications table pulled up here because it's just a nice way to show it. So if I go down to here and I select tables, I can actually like hover over a column header or a row header and it'll actually highlight and show me both through the highlights as well as in text at the top. It'll show me how those things are counted as related, how they might be read off to a screen reader, so that I can kind of tell, okay, well, here it actually identifies that I have a column and a row header, and it tells me like how that information is presented, so I can make sure that the relationship of the info is going to be communicated to the user. They're not going to be like totally in the dark about why this cell says not applicable. But you do have like other ones. It gives you like different graphics, images, buttons that you can use. You can get text spacing ones, which just show you like if someone increases or decreases the spacing for the text. Is it still going to flow right, or is it going to overlap and cause problems where the person wouldn't be able to read it? You can have HTML code sniffers, which just tell you if they notice any like weird HTML issues. There is Wave, a web accessibility evaluation tool, which actually like does like a little overlay and it kind of shows you like here's some of your issues as well as giving you an actual like list of the issues. So that can be something great. Let's see. Now another like testing plan sort of that I recommend to some people if they like just want a way to start. You know, I mentioned the visa one earlier. There's also the Section 508 ICT testing baseline. This is what's used for government Section 508 testing. It's also like if you do the trusted tester certification, this is basically what they're using. In fact, this just is what they're using. And it kind of does something similar. You'll notice like it goes through and it's like looking for some of the same things you saw mentioned in the Axe DevTools and in the Accessibility Insights. So it's going through like audio, video, language, parsing, which is like just checking like is the HTML written in such a way that the browser can actually parse it correctly. Keyboard accessibility, focus, things of that nature. So this is actually a really, really good thing to go through. Now, we've talked about like, you know, a lot of this is more focused around websites. You can use these guidelines to some degree on like Word documents or a PowerPoint. Now again, it kind of comes down to the whole thing of which ones are going to apply and which ones aren't. Because web content accessibility guidelines is dealing with anything that's accessible on the web. So it can be video, audio, Word documents, PDFs, a whole host of other things. So if you're wanting to know how to like test those specifically, and you're wanting like a place to start, where can you look? Well, you'll notice here under this ICT baseline that it happens to mention this accessibility community of practice. Now I'm gonna just type that here into the Google. Goodness gracious, did I just say that the way I think I did? I did. Okay, here we go. Accessibility testing for electronic documents. The community of practice also has this AEDCOP. That stands for Accessible Electronic Documents Community of Practice. This is kind of, in a way, it's similar to like that other, the Section 508 ICT baseline. It's built by the government. This is specifically, you'll notice it's on the actual section508.gov page. But the community of this Accessible Electronic Documents Community of Practice, or AEDCOP, it deals specifically with documents. So things like Word documents, text files, PDFs, spreadsheets, PowerPoints. How do we make those accessible to people? And it's great. It even has like creating accessible video and social media This is like an amazing resource if you just need some way to figure out this stuff. So like for instance, you got a PDF you need to test. Well, you'll notice under here, it actually has a PDF testing and remediation guide, checklist, baseline testing process. This is the same as that Section 508 ICT baseline that I showed you a moment ago. This is just the version that is specifically tailored to PDFs. And again, like, you know, that's the important thing. You do want to customize your testing based on what you're testing. When I'm testing a website, I'm not going to look at it the same way as I am a PDF because they're just not formatted the same. There's going to be a lot of similarities. In PDFs, you still have like tagging, which is essentially the same as using like an H tag in HTML. It's just the PDF equivalent of it. You're still going to have like images with like descriptors and things of that nature. Tables that are marked as presentation instead of being data tables. Things of that nature. So this is a great resource if you ever need it. I guess really that's like all I've really got that I have on my head right now today. I'm not going to edit down this video because again, this is kind of me going through and I'm just sort of, it's a little bit of a mess because I'm kind of going through the thought processes of thinking, okay, what do I think of when I think of accessibility testing? That being said, I hope that I have provided a lot of good resources here. I'll try to put links to some of the things that I've described in the description for this video. And if there's things that I brought up that you have other resources that you would recommend for, I would love for you to share that with me. If there's things that I left out that you think that in an accessibility presentation I should try to include, you know, again, please tell me. If I go to do like the actual presentation for this, it is going to be a lot more organized, even if it's without a PowerPoint, which I am still kind of leaning towards. But I haven't like gone over probably everything I should for this. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So thank you so much. If you made it to this point, you know, thank you for putting up with my rambling. And I hope you watch some more of my other videos in the future. Bye.